while we're waiting for 6 o'clock.
Well, this is true.
That's what we're really waiting for, but let's see. Yeah, I don't see BJ or Bill yet. Rita, if you want to forward that on to the planning board right now, you can, but like I said, I think we're going to take input tonight and after the meeting as well, so I don't think it's critical.
Okay. I didn't read it closely yet, but I just skimmed it and it looks like it's supporting the overlay zone, but I will forward it on right now.
So
Ron, if we're going to recommend an action to forward this to the town council, maybe we should have that read at the meeting.
Well, I guess that's a question. I don't know that we're going to be ready after this meeting to forward it. I think that we're going to be getting some input tonight, and then, I mean, it's up to
Okay.
you. It's up to you. If you want to read what Rita just forwarded, that's fine. I'm not going to be able to read it right now. I'm kind of busy trying to get this meeting set up.
Go ahead. I will leave you alone.
No, you're fine, but I'm just, there's BJ. So anyway, yeah, I wasn't necessarily anticipating that the board was going to be in a position to forward it on tonight. I think depending on the input we get tonight, there'll be some perhaps further discussion, allow the board to.
Well, if it turns out that we're ready to make a recommendation, then we can request Rita to read the memo.
Okay, that makes sense. Looks like we have Chris McNally tonight in the solicitor's spot.
Good evening, all.
Hi, Chris.
Hello, Chris.
Everybody having a good old time?
Always.
Excellent.
You know, the town council has,
Oh, good.
There she is.
Hello.
Hi,
Hey,
BJ.
BJ.
Good to see you all.
Indeed.
Bill.
And here's Bill.
Hi, Bill.
Hey, Bill.
Hello, everyone.
Mr. Nash, how are you?
Good. Good as I can be.
Oh, I guess we're all present and accounted for, so that's good.
I have 5:59 on my clock, so in a minute we will open the meeting.
Has everybody got their vaccine except for me? Chris, I bet you don't have yours yet either.
I did manage to get a first dose, so I'm waiting on a second dose.
Rita, you as well.
I have two.
Good for
I
you
have
guys.
two.
Well done, Paul.
I have 0.
You got to get on that early morning thing, Bill, and just refresh.
I know it. I know. Tomorrow's my day to do that. Yes.
There you go. Paul, I'm going to just mute my device because I'm typing and I don't want you to hear me pecking away, but I'll pipe up when needed, okay?
That's fine. I have 6 o'clock, so this meeting will come to order. This is a special public workshop meeting to discuss a zoning overlay amendment for the airport. We will start by an audible taking of attendance. Mr. Pyrrhic.
Present.
Mr. Chumo.
John, you're muted.
Present.
Thank you. Mrs. Owen,
Present.
Mr. Weber,
Present.
Mr. Fenton,
Here.
Mr. Nash,
Present.
and I am here. As I mentioned, this is a public workshop to discuss a zoning overlay amendment for the airport. This work was done by a subcommittee composed of Joe Pyrrhic, BJ Owen, and Mike Fenton. The subcommittee was chaired by Joe. We will have, and of course, they had the very capable assistance of planning department staff. And the way this meeting will go, we'll have a presentation from Ron, during which Joe will discuss the process the subcommittee found. And after the presentation is over, we'll have comments from the planning board and then open it up to the public. Ron, the floor is yours.
Okay. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here. As always, it takes a minute to go. So. All right, can you all see the screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Yes.
So this is actually a pretty quick presentation. The agenda for the meeting, we're going to go through just this brief slide presentation, discuss a little bit of the process and background that we went through to get to this point with the draft ordinance. We'll review the highlights of the draft. Then there will be planning board discussion and questions, and then we'll open it up to the public for comments and questions. So for the members of the public that are on, at that point in the meeting, we'll ask you to raise your hand using the button in the Zoom app, or if you're calling in on a phone, you would do a *9, dial *9 on your phone to raise your hand when we get to that point in the meeting. So the process that we went through, or that we're going through, we're going to receive public input tonight. Any input that results in the need for revisions to the draft, those would be discussed. The planning board will discuss what changes they wish to make. And at some point, whether it's tonight or at a subsequent meeting, the planning board will make a recommendation and forward the draft to the town council for consideration. And the town council will hold a formal public hearing and 2 readings, as they do with any zoning ordinance amendment. So there will be, excuse me, ample opportunity at that time for additional public input. And then at the town council level, of course, if they choose to, the town council can make any revisions to the draft prior to its adoption. So a little bit of background. Why are we doing this? Well, under state law, the town is required to adopt airport hazard zoning. There's been provision in the Middletown Comprehensive Plan for several years, an action item as shown on the screen that calls for developing and adopting an airport hazard area overlay district. And we've had communications on and off with the Rhode Island Airport Corporation. They've produced a handbook, or a guidebook, I should say, several years ago with recommendations for language and process and lots of background information that was useful as the subcommittee and the planning board were working on developing this draft. And again, it goes back to that requirement in state law that the town have this type of zoning on the books. The planning board work. Joe, did you want to pipe up here and talk about the subcommittee a little bit?
Sure. I'd be happy to. Thank you, Ron. Joe Pyrrhic, planning board member. We deem this to be very important. Again, looking to be in compliance and to in compliance with the state mandate. I think in pulling the subcommittee together, I know BJ, you can speak for yourself, but I know you're familiar with the area intimately. I think you live close by. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. As a matter of fact, I spent 45 minutes at the airport yesterday, and it was very interesting and very revealing.
Yes, so I think, we had 4 subcommittee meetings back in 3 in 2019. The last subcommittee meeting was on January 15th, 2020. So candidly, I was refreshing my memory for over the last 15 months or so back to that last meeting we had. But our process was good. We looked at all the materials that Ron and Rita and with counsel from Chris McNally that had been provided. And, my perspective, I came at it from, always less is more, right? I don't want to overregulate, and certainly being mindful of the opportunities that the airport presents. And, some of the hazards we see as Middletown residents of, planes coming in and leaving and so forth and so on. So I think we're pretty mindful of that. We really dissected, I would say, the handbook that was provided by the state, looked at the codes of compliance, and then really with Ron and Rita's help, tried to construct a draft which balanced out elements that were presented in these materials that came from the state. One of the significant things that I personally looked at was the regulations or paperwork that the town of Westerly put into place, where they took a similar approach and looked at their ordinance and overlay district and really tried to kind of cherry pick what we thought were the best elements of that. And then in the context of, hey, we're Middletown, we're not Westerly, and how does that relate to our state airport here in Middletown? So, I think what we ended up back prior to COVID hitting was coming up with this draft set of regulations that relate to the runway protection zones and some of the other things that the state really wants us to look at. And I think we've got the framework for a pretty good document, but most importantly to me is getting the public input and then kind of fine tuning what we have based on that, and then proceeding to the town council. That's
Great.
it.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe.
So the draft regulations, they're identified as being what would be a new article in the zoning ordinance 11A, which that's also subject to change. So just as a quick overview, the proposed ordinance creates an overlay zone, which we'll talk a little bit more about the different areas on the next slide. Requires development plan review by the planning board for significant developments, so subdivisions, commercial developments within the height compliance area. We would require also, as part of the development plan review submission process, documentation. I forget how it's worded at the moment, but it's either through FAA or RIAC, confirming that they've reviewed the plans and offered their opinion as to compliance with FAA regulations. And then another point that this is a zoning ordinance. So with any zoning ordinance or an amendment, at the time it's adopted, any pre-existing non-conforming uses have the ability to continue. So even if it was a use that was found or under the ordinance would have been prohibited if it was new, if it's a pre-existing use, it's allowed to continue. So a little bit more detail on the runway. We'll bring the map up again in a minute, but on the runway protection zone, which is the areas closest to the ends of the runways, it's a trapezoidal shape right at the ends of the runways. It's a proposed very limited amount of types of uses that would be allowed really parking lots, open spaces, agriculture would be allowed within that runway protection zone area. Most of the runway protection zones are on airport property. However, there is private property that is impacted as well. I think I counted about 15 or so properties that would be impacted, private properties that would be impacted by that runway protection zone. And then the larger area is what we're calling the height compliance area. So this, and maybe I'll just go to the map right now. So this area, these hatched areas are the runway protection zones at the end of each runway. The stippled area, that larger area that's actually mostly to the east and a little bit to the north, those are areas in town where an analysis demonstrated that building structures to the height limit in the zoning ordinance for the zoning district that they're in, which is typically 35 feet in a residential zone and 40 feet in an industrial or commercial zone, that those structures at those heights had the potential to penetrate the FAA surfaces. So because of that, whoops, let me go back. Because of that, we require or proposing to require additional review of developments within those areas. So as I mentioned earlier, any substantial development, again, subdivisions, commercial developments within the height compliance area would go through a development plan review process. And that's something the planning board would review the proposal, which in any case, even without this proposed district, any commercial development in any subdivision is going to get planning board review anyway. So it's not really that much more of a burden on the developer. Single family residential, a single family home would not be subject to that particular review. Single family homes are still subject to any FAA regulations. However, it's just that it wouldn't go through the planning board review process. So that's, let's see if I missed anything here. So in the runway protection zone, I didn't mention this before, there's in addition to the use limitations, there's a 15-foot height limit on any structures or vegetation that do occur within the runway protection zone. There would be that 15-foot height limit. In the height compliance area, the height concerns reference only the structures. There's no reference or proposal at this point to regulate the height of vegetation, including trees. That's not in the proposed ordinance. So again, the map, just keep that up for a minute for folks to look at. It's also available online. And if you got a notice in the mail, I think we provided information on where you'd be able to get the map if it wasn't included. And with that, I think we're ready for discussion. Maybe I'm going to stop sharing my screen and maybe I'll ask Rita to talk a little bit more about the analysis that she did in defining the boundaries of that height compliance area, just so people have a better understanding of how that was done, if you wouldn't mind, Rita.
Sure. So the height compliance area looks at the ground elevation and then the FAA regulated airspaces, which come off in angles from the ground. So the reason that there's more significant area to the northeast that's highlighted as the height compliance area is because there's a large hill there. So the planes are looking at their air surfaces based on sea level. So with the hill, and then you add in a 35-foot residential structure on top of that, there's a potential where a development could penetrate that airspace, which you don't see in the other parts of the to the southwest of town. So that's really what I looked at. And then I extrapolated it to the whole parcel. So we kind of gave a little bit of a buffer there. So a little bit of error just in case it wasn't exact with our calculations.
Great, thanks.
Rita, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Did you say that the FAA looks at their flight zones from sea level, even if the runways are above sea level?
it starts calculating at the edge of the runway, but the calculation is a plane above sea level. So that's why it does start calculating at the height of the runway and then goes off on an angle.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
I've got a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, John Shomo and I are impacted by this particular zone, and I'm not sure why we should be, because the pilots are supposed to, when the wind is coming from the south, they're supposed to fly at a 90-degree angle, not over our houses, to go down to the end of the runway and then make a left turn and land. Landing into the wind is kind of a thing the pilots like to do. So I'm not sure why we would be in that zone, because the pilots really shouldn't be flying over our houses, which they do on occasion. And I would suppose if we're going to sell our house, we would have to disclose that we're in that particular zone as a usual disclosure for somebody. So that's one question I have.
So that before you go on, the first thing I would suggest actually, and I'll ask Chris to chime in on this. I didn't realize that you and John were within that district, which means it may be appropriate to talk about recusing from the discussion. Chris, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would, pardon, I didn't realize that either, Ron. I'll, bringing up valid points, there is a potential conflict of interest there. And out of an abundance of caution, a recusal on that for anybody who's abutted or included in one of the proposed zones. That's probably the appropriate step to take.
But I understand that. I have no particular prejudice one way or the other. I mean, I've been living here for 20 years. Whatever happens, happens. It's fine. And only 4 or 5 times a year do I have a guy that wanted to be a Zero pilot for the Japanese fly over my house. Most of them are pretty good about it. Yeah,
So that's
one question I have. And secondly, like most things, when we provide this ordinance and get the council to agree on it, does it have to be approved by the airport people upstate?
no, this is local zoning, so it doesn't go.
Let me backfill a little bit, Ron. Are we taking a vote on anything tonight, or are we really more in the planning and discussion phase?
It's up to the board. And where we are at the end of the conversation tonight as to whether they'll be in a position to vote. But
Okay.
I would suggest that even participating in the conversation might be an issue leading towards development of the ordinance.
Well,
Okay.
fair. As a member of the board, I think you're right. I mean, and if we look at our standard practice would be that anytime a member of a particular board or committee is in a butter or otherwise directly has a direct connection to the issue at hand, that recusal is the right course.
Okay, that makes sense.
So,
Yeah,
Art,
but-
John,
I'll tell you what's interesting is our entire development is not in the zone. And I think that's because the property drops off to the west. And there's
Elevation wise, you mean, Arthur?
yeah, down further to the west, there's a hill downhill.
Right.
So I think that's why the rest of the development's not included, because the height deal is not a problem at that point.
So John and Art, just to be clear, that you've been advised that you should consider recusing. It's your choice as to whether or not you wish to recuse.
I'm happy to recuse.
So if you do,
It's
you
the
do-
proper thing to do.
if you do choose to recuse, you're welcome to stay in the meeting, but I would just suggest that you turn your camera off and your microphone off. You're welcome to obviously continue to listen.
Very good.
Effectively as a member of the public, no longer a member of the board for this.
Thank you very much. I think that's the proper thing for us to do.
thank you, John. Thank you, Art.
Okay,
So
Ron,
Rita will note for the minutes that Art and John have recused.
Yeah, excuse me.
yes, BJ.
Yeah, I'm on Forest Avenue. I do not abut the airport. I am not, I don't get too much noise from the airport. I think the only thing that I get sometimes is that red helicopter.
Well, are you in the zone, BJ?
I'm just abutting the zone, but I don't feel that I'm in it.
Okay.
Okay, so at this point, does any member of the planning board have any comments to offer?
I got one.
Mike?
Okay, so Ron, looking at the map there and the runway protection zones. So you're saying there are several properties that are partially in the runway protection zones?
Right, yep. Well, maybe what I'll do
Okay,
is
that
I'll,
would be like the northwest and the southwest RPZs.
yep, I can share my screen again. I'll put the map back up. That might be easier. Okay, can you all see the map?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
so that trapezoidal area with the hatched lines at the end of each runway, those are the what we're calling the runway protection zones. It's referred to, I think, as Zone A in the FAA or the RIAC airport map. So you can see that the gray area is airport property. But where that hatching overlaps a white area, that's the area those areas are privately owned properties. So you can see up on Elephant Lane, there's a little sliver there. And then some more impacted properties as you get to the south along Forest Avenue and East Main Road.
Where is the Potter League?
The Potter League is actually on airport property.
Right, I thought.
Okay, so now you talked about like development in these zones, and then there's also the issue of existing structures and existing trees and so forth in these zones.
Right.
Okay, so there's different rules that apply to something that's coming in or something that's existing, right?
Well, it's as I said, with any zoning amendment, anything that's existing prior to the amendment is considered to be pre-existing, a non-conforming use, but it's considered a legal use and is allowed to remain.
Okay, does that include trees?
The ordinance as drafted does not impact trees except for in the runway protection zone.
Okay, that's what I'm talking about. It's runway protection
If in the runway protection zone there are trees, they would not be impacted by that 15-foot height limit because they'd be pre-existing uses. Pre-existing uses.
Well, that's a problem, isn't it, for the people that use those? They use the airport. Isn't this the whole thing that we're talking about? Is if we want to keep those runway protection zones safe, the structures and trees or whatever's in there has to abide by that height limit.
Well, certainly anything new would be subject to the ordinance, and Chris might wish to chime in, but as far as I understand, unless there's specific, like a sunset provision put in the zoning ordinance that states that within a certain amount of time, compliance must be achieved, then those uses are allowed to continue as pre-existing non-conforming uses.
I assume
That would
that
be
when the
correct. That would
airport
be
was,
correct.
I assume when the airport runways were built, this was looked at, and there was nothing in those zones that exceeded those heights. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have built them, right?
I don't know. I don't know what the situation was when the airport was built.
I mean, the airport's been there for about 60 or 70 years, hasn't it?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay, so now this whole issue of us, putting together a zoning ordinance and the state coming up with some sort of, laws that, protect the operation of these airports has been in the works for a long time. And I don't know if it's, partially the town's issue or partially the state's issue, for letting this thing drag on. But the whole thing, that what you come down to is what was a safe runway or protection zone at the time this thing was built may not be a safe runway protection zone now, because trees and so forth have been allowed to grow exceeding the height, that's allowable for those areas. I mean, isn't this the thing that we're supposed to be doing here, putting together a zone that protects this, the airport operations so that, it doesn't create a safety hazard to the pilots and the people using the airport or even the residents that live nearby.
That's exactly what we're trying to do.
Mhm.
So that whole issue of what can we do in this ordinance to alleviate any issues, that create this safety hazard.
Well, this is the draft that was put forward by the subcommittee that you sat on, Mike, and this is what we have to work with. If you want to make some suggestions for changes, I guess you can go ahead and do that now.
Yeah, I think we have to do that. I think otherwise, what's the use of the ordinance if we can't, keep the airport operating safely,
I can jump in. It also raises a question in my mind. What happens, say if a private property has a tree on it that's 12 feet tall right now, but in 5 years, it's 16 feet tall. What happens then?
Yeah.
It would be a zoning violation.
Yeah, may I
Have
say
to be
something?
trimmed.
Go ahead, BJ.
Thank you, because this relates to the conversation that I had yesterday with the people who were running the airport or who were taking care of the airport when I was there around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This is exactly what they said, Paul, that when this small tree was okay initially, all of a sudden the pilot's coming in now and senses that there's a big obstacle that he has to hop over and then fly down. And it wasn't there 20, 25 years ago. This is just what Mike said. And this was part of the conversation that I had with these airport people. I found it very interesting. And I'm looking at a map now dated August 20th, 2019.
Well, it sounds like there are some questions that still need to be answered by the subcommittee, but why don't we, are there other comments from planning board members?
Yeah, I mean,
Go
yeah,
ahead,
Paul,
Bill.
if I could- thank you. So, yeah, I mean, I hear Mike's concerns and BJ's, and obviously for good reason this is being done, but what I wanted to say was, I see 12 attendees here. Obviously, there's some issues that the abutters need to be heard and want to be heard. I mean, I've seen what I've read the ordinance and seen the map, and I know that there are some issues here that we've already touched on. So I don't know how much more we can do without maybe hearing from the public. But maybe just one more time, Joe. I know you were the chair of this, and I know this was tough to go back and sort through in my mind, because it happened, even a year ago. Sometimes I lose my mind. Does that sound about right to you? I mean, but the people that are here, I think, is what I'm kind of interested in, and seeing if we can.
Well,
work
I
with
I
them.
think, again, as the chair of the subcommittee, we looked again at different communities where there are state airports and how have they addressed some of the same concerns, okay? Because
Right.
safety is kind of universal, right? Nobody wants the Middletown Airport, state airport, to be the unsafest airport in the
Right.
state of Rhode Island, right? So, I went back through some materials today, and what we tried to do was not regulate use per se, but really just try to identify and eliminate what we deemed were airport hazards. And unfortunately, trees, BJ, you touch on it, most of the time they tend to grow. And a 25-year-old tree,
True.
is going to be different, 10 years from now than it is today. And somebody raised a question, it's 12 feet, and then it grows to 16 feet. Hey, newsflash, tree needs to be trimmed because it's too high. It presents a hazard.
Joe,
So I
but
think
on
it's
that
important
point-
for the public to know that we weren't trying to regulate use within the overlay, but really to identify and eliminate hazards so our airport could be a safe airport today and going forward.
Yeah,
True.
yeah, if I could just follow up on that, I agree with that. But what concerns me is, and I don't disagree why that should be in the ordinance, because trees grow, and frankly, trees should grow. but they happen to grow in an area that they are a hazard. But if it's going to become a violation of our ordinance in the future, then we're going to be responsible for having to enforce the violation. Well, I mean, if it's a state mandated regulation that we're trying to incorporate, the burden on the town to have to be the regulator
Mhm.
of this, it concerns me. I'm uncomfortable having our zoning officer being in the town bearing the expense of having to be the enforcer of that regulation. I mean, it's a hazard, it's a problem, but it feels like the state is pushing that burden on to the town, and that makes me uncomfortable.
BJ and then Mike.
I understand. Yes, thank you. I understand what Bill is saying, because one of the things that the committee did was to look at what was going on with the Westerly Airport. And the town of Westerly has lawsuits. I don't know if they've been settled regarding the airport in Westerly. And this is something that hopefully we wanted to avoid. Am I correct, Joe and Mike?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes.
Mike?
Well, one of the runways here at Newport has already been, shortened because of obstructions in the runway protection zone. So already, we have an unsafe situation that doesn't allow us to use the full capability of the airport. So that restricts the use of the airport at the moment. There is a bill in the General Assembly that's addressing some of these issues right now. I don't know if they're going to finally settle it, or is it going to be, another, issue, after it finally goes through it. I asked my daughter is on the General Assembly, so I asked her to look into it for me and see if she can find out information. But so far, she says all she knows is that there's something coming up about runway restoration at the airports. So that's something that's being discussed at the moment, I think, in some subcommittees. So, but I still think there's still the safety issue, and there's still the airport operations, that if they don't get addressed by this ordinance, then they have to get addressed somewhere. Maybe it's a state law, maybe the state has to do it, but so I'm not sure if what we're putting together here is needs to be amended, to be a part of that solution, or is it just we're going to let the state, take care of it, because we feel it's their issue.
That's my point. Yes. Thank you, Mike.
Any other comments from board members? Let's open it up to the public, Ron.
So again, anyone interested in speaking or asking a question, making a comment, raise your hand, and we'll take the comments in the order that they're coming in. So let's see here. First one, Jean Parati. Jean, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
You know what? I'm not speaking. I must have raised my hand by accident. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. Let's see. Roberta Duffy. Go ahead, Roberta, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, Roberta
Roberta.
Duffy. I'm at 280 Forest Avenue. I am in the airport hazard zone. I have a few questions. What other towns or cities in the state of Rhode Island have implemented this airport hazard zone?
As far as I know, we were only able to identify Westerly's ordinance, if I remember correctly. Is that right, Rita? Was that the only one? Yeah.
Has it been implemented, or is it still in the stages, planning stages?
No, it's been adopted in
Oh.
Westerly. Yep.
Okay. And what if the town doesn't implement this? What happens?
Well, we're in violation of the statute, which is nothing new, I guess, because the statute's been around for a while. I don't know, Chris, if there's any other ramifications if the town were to not comply with the statute and not adopt the ordinance.
I wish I had a ready answer for you on that, Ron. I'd have to look and see what statutes might be applicable there.
Mike, do you have something to offer?
I simply can't answer that right now.
Okay.
Mike?
Oh, does the town have any liability for safety if we don't address some of those things?
No, I'm asking if the town does nothing, is there any repercussions from the state for doing nothing? Not talking about safety. I mean, just not implementing it. What happens if we don't implement it?
I think the answer was, Ron just answered, we're in violation and we don't know what the
We don't.
fallout is, and that's something we need to research. But there's repercussions if we don't comply with state law, and
Possibly
some
a
are
fine.
more adhered to than others. And
We can, Roberta, we can look into that a little bit more and maybe get back to you.
Yeah. And, you know, if we do implement it, and let's say I have a 25-foot tree and the town comes to me and says, you got to cut your tree to 15 feet. Is that my financial responsibility? And what happens if I say, no, I don't want to? What happens then? What's the second step?
So the way it's written now, if it's a pre-existing tree, it's not going to be impacted
Okay.
by the ordinance, because as I said earlier, the zoning ordinance doesn't allow us to go back in time, so to speak. If something was installed after the ordinance is adopted, it would be a zoning violation. So what would happen is the zoning officer would go out there and issue a notice of violation, and ultimately, if there's non-compliance, it ends up, I believe, in municipal court.
Okay. So my house was here before the airport was built.
Right.
That's how old this house is. And I'm looking ahead that maybe someday when I want to sell my house, of course, it's going to be on, I'm going to have this airport overlay hazard district attached to my property. And my other thought is, what if the insurance company comes around after this is implemented and says, well, since you're in an airport hazard, district, now you're going to have to pay more for insurance in case a plane drops on your house. It's financial hardship. It is going to be for most of the homeowners. We're here before the airport. We've complied with the airport, whatever they wanted to do. I have a 20-foot fence in my backyard. I have a propane gas tank within 15 feet of my property. Whatever they've wanted to do, we've implemented. And this just seems to be another step overreaching into my property, into my pocket. It will be a financial hardship. Not to mention my taxes. I mean, if you're going to put limitations on what I can do on my home, I don't think my taxes should be equal to the person across the street who can put a second floor on his home, and I cannot. So, it is a financial burden for people that live here. Am I worried about safety? I am. But as I say, it's not always the surrounding area that makes it unsafe. There's been a lot of unsafe pilots in and out of this airport that don't comply. And I think they're more of a safety hazard than the obstruction pole they put in the backyard and told us we had to have to light obstructions. And now they're telling us the obstruction pole is now an obstruction. So it's, everything they've done, every step of the way, we've done whatever they said. And every meeting I've ever gone to, which is everyone the airport has, they keep telling us how safe this airport is. This is a safe airport. And, doing all these things will make it safer. And, to come back a few years later and say, yeah, those obstruction poles are really an obstruction. It makes me nervous to put any more regulations on what they've already told us to do, and now changing their mind on things. So, yeah, there's only 15 homes that are in those 15 private homes.
Not homes. I think it was 15 properties.
15 properties.
So there may not be as many structures.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just want to say this is going to be a financial hardship for whoever those property owners are.
Yep.
Be it in your insurance, be it in, you can't put a second floor on your home, but your neighbor across the street can, you know, and you're going to have to sell your home when you do go to sell your home, or for insurance purposes, whatever. We're being labeled a hazard zone. That does not sound good at all when you go to sell your home. You know, it really doesn't. Is there any other hazard zones in the town of Middletown?
Nothing with that type of terminology.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean-
there's flood hazard areas, so I guess
Yeah.
that's one.
And their insurances do go up because of it. You know,
Yeah.
because if you're in the flood zone, you need flood insurance now.
Right.
And it's definitely costlier than regular insurance. If I'm in the airport hazard zone, my insurance is definitely going to go up. And that'll
Yeah,
be,
Ron, I was just going to reference the flood, the recent changes in the flood zones as a sort of an analogous change.
Yep.
and I think that's all I want to say. I'm sure I'll think of more things, but thank you.
All right. Thanks, Roberta.
Can
Roberta.
I just say though, to Chris's comment, but
Go ahead,
that's an
Bill.
existing zone. That's an existing flood hazard zone. This is a new proposed hazard zone. So I think there's a difference there. I think there's a distinct, you know, we're now taking a parcel and or a bunch of parcels and identifying it as hazard area, whereas the flood hazards have existed and have been there for as long as they've existed. This is an existing condition. This is by default, but now we're identifying it because we have to. I get it, but it's not an easy mix here.
Are we ready to move on to the next?
Next person on.
That did sort of go into new territory in certain places.
So the next person is Dennis. Dennis, go ahead with your question or comment.
Yes, hello. And,
Identify yourself first, please.
oh, certainly, yes. My name is Dennis Doherty, a longtime Middletown resident and owner of the property towards Oliphant Lane, towards West Main Road, towards the what I guess is considered the runway 16. So it's my property is being impacted in two ways. The runway protection zone is going to, if enacted, take over a third, and then the height restriction will take over the other 2/3. So my first reaction is it's quite a wallop. It's an economic hardship for sure. It's puts a crimp on the plans I had. It was twofold: buy the property and then develop according to and under all of the zoning regulations to develop a little bit of a storage tradesman center like that's down the road. So I am wanting to be a good neighbor, but certainly right off the bat, it has diminished the value of the property, and not quite sure if this goes into effect. It feels like a taking, and if as such, is there compensation for enacting an ordinance that wasn't there before, but now is and perpetually will be forever. So that's one thing. And I have to, I'm excited that I have a voice in the forum, and that it's the town that has control over things. It starts going to higher powers. I feel as though I lose a little bit more voice in it. So I'm glad it's at this level. Appreciate the work that's been done, and am just wondering if there are only 15 to 20 properties impacted. Will it be on a case-by-case scenario on what how impacted the property is, and what can be done to alleviate or minimize the damage? And there'd been a little bit of conversation just briefly with the planning department on some of the things that I still could do, but it will also add another layer of restriction and board authority that has to be gone through in order to develop the property. So I guess there are other things that I can say, but just to be on the brief side of things, just wanted to give my concerns. There are a couple of different legal questions. I mean, it says in my reading that the town is mandated to come up with these regulations, but it didn't strictly say what the regulations would be. Is that correct? I guess this is to Mr. Pirrick on the subcommittee. The regulations that came up with stuff that you guys cobbled together, or was this what they said they needed to see?
Well, I think Chris can add to it, but again, we were given guidelines in a handbook, Dennis, to kind of serve as a guide. And again, I want to just state for everybody, you know, my marching orders to the subcommittee were less is more, right? Let's try to see if we can get in compliance and try to keep it as unobtrusive as possible. If that indeed could be the case. And this public meeting, public workshop, I think from my perspective as the chair of the subcommittee, the most important thing for me is not what BJ, Mike, and I came up with in consultation with Ron and Rita. It's hearing from the public and understanding what the concerns are, because I mean, we're the advocates for the community, right? I don't work for the airport corporation or the state. You know, my responsibility is for the safety and welfare of the community in Middletown. So appreciate, Dennis, your insights and your concerns and everybody else that's weighing in tonight.
And if I could just clarify too, one thing, the 15 properties that I referenced, that's in the runway protection zone areas. So those are properties that I saw as being impacted by the runway protection zones that are private properties. There are many, many more properties. I don't know what the number is, Rita, but probably close to 100.
Yeah, I think it was more than that. I think it was closer to 200.
So that number of properties, close to 200 properties that are impacted by the height compliance area. So it's that 15 I was referencing was only those that would be impacted by the runway protection zone. So just wanted to make that clear.
And Mr. Chairman, if I might add something as well.
Go ahead, Rita, and then BJ.
As a point of clarification of sort of where the starting point for these regulations came from, if I remember correctly, and it has been a while, but the regulations that we drafted mimic what is already in place from the FAA standards. So the runway protection zone section is already defined in FAA standards using a different language. It's called something like Zone A, but there already is a maximum height structure height of 15 feet in that area. So this is just mimicking that. And same thing with the greater area that we've assigned to the height compliance area. Any development in that area it would be on the onus of the homeowner to prove that their development is not penetrating their FAA airspace. So if somebody wanted to put up a large antenna or telephone pole or something like that, they should be getting those approvals. What this is drafting is also bringing the town into that process and providing a process for those regulations to be shown to the town before approval is gotten from the town for building permits.
Thank you. BJ, you had a comment?
Yes, I don't want to be boring, but if I could just read a tiny bit from the regulations that were going to be proposed, and it's called Continuance of Existing Use or Structure. No airport zoning regulations adopted under this chapter shall require the removal, lowering, or other change or alteration of any structure not conforming to the regulations when adopted, or otherwise interfere with the continuance of any non-conforming use except as specified. And then it goes on to tell a little bit more. Replacement of a dimensionally non-conforming nature. And it discusses that. And I think that had a lot to do with some of the comments that were being made by people. And I can understand how they feel, particularly when it hits your pocketbook.
Thank you. Ron, are there other members of the public?
Yes. Neil Galvin.
Hey, everyone. Andrew Galvin, 201 Island Drive. I happen to live between John and Art, so, I'd like to reiterate their comments, but I think practically speaking, going back to what Bill Nash said, enforcing this, I'm looking out the window and I see trees that I don't know if they're 35 feet, 32 feet, 38 feet above the runway height. The expense of keeping those in compliance, would that be borne by the owner of the property? Or is there going to be money made available by the town to implement the appropriate landscaping costs associated with enforcing this? And I appreciate everybody's previous comments. I do agree with most of them, but I'd like to hear the feedback on that. Thank you.
So the ordinance, the enforcement of the ordinance and the compliance with the ordinance is ultimately the responsibility of the property owner. So, as proposed at the moment, there's no funding mechanism from the town or otherwise to assist property owners.
But Ron, can I just add?
Go ahead,
assuming
Bill.
we move this forward to the council, this is an ordinance that the council ultimately approves, and they should take that into consideration, or they may, or can we even suggest that they take that into consideration if they're inclined to approve this? Because that's the bigger picture here is this is an ordinance that becomes, we're doing our due diligence. The subcommittee has done their work. We're the planning board. We try to do our best effort and put the best ordinance forward to the council to act on it. And if they are in fact going to adopt this ordinance because they feel they're going to be told that we have to or will be in non-compliance, then we have to put forward our best effort as far as in the interest of safety. But also it becomes their burden to adopt this, maybe with some consideration for that exact question.
Are there other members of the public?
Yes. Well, Neil, or I'm sorry, Andrew, were you done with your questions?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, Andrew.
Next one is Michelle. Michelle, go ahead and unmute yourself and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Michelle Siegel, and I live on Cogshell Circle, adjacent to the buffer zone. And both my husband and I tried on 3 different computers to download the draft agenda items, and we were unable to. They said they were not, that the site was not available. So we're a little bit in the dark here, and I'm just wondering if Cogshell Circle is impacted at all by what's going on here.
I believe it is. I can pop. Are you able to see what we're showing on the screen?
I can just see your faces.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen and that'll bring the map back up. So are you able to see the map now?
Okay, I see. Yes, I'm looking at the map.
Yep, so there's Cogshell Way that goes in off of Oliphant and then
Right.
it turns onto Cogshell Circle. So
That's right.
so
And we're
Cogshell,
right there. We're right there at the very corner where you see the word circle kind of bending down a little bit. Our property is right there at that corner.
so is it that one house that's not actually shaded? Right at the curve?
Okay, no, it's follow
Right.
the word circle to the left there. Keep
Yeah,
going
so-
with that. So all the way down, right there.
Yep, so you'd be within what we're describing as the height compliance area. So that's the area that where you're, there's no height limit per se, except that any new development, and we're talking substantial development, commercial or subdivisions would have to go through a development plan review process. Single family residential or expansions of single family residential wouldn't go through that development plan review process. However, you're also still subject to any FAA regulations. So
Okay.
Even though you might not be captured under the zoning ordinance as currently drafted, you'd still be subject to any FAA limitations on the height of your structure.
Okay, all right. I don't see that as an issue. Are we considered to be in that hazard zone?
Well, it's called the height compliance area, which is, I guess,
Okay.
a sub area of what we're describing as the airport
Gotcha.
hazard
Okay.
zone. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I guess that answers our question, right? All righty, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, next up is Bruce. Go ahead, Bruce, unmute yourself and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Bruce Vanasek from Rhode Island Nurseries.
Hey, Bruce.
We're east of the airport. My question is, did RIAC share with you guys about the avigation easements that they purchased around the airport?
We've been in the loop, I'd say, as to their efforts to purchase those easements. I don't know personally all of the easements that they purchased, but we're aware that they've been in that process.
Has the board reviewed those purchases and looked at their plans to see if your plan, to me, it just appears off the top of my head that what you're proposing is more restrictive than where they condemned my land and we had to fight for compensation. They didn't condemn the land per se, they condemned the airspace above the land. But it appears to me that your 15-foot height restriction in the RPZ zone is more restrictive than what their avigation easement was.
I haven't seen the easements. I don't know.
So yeah, that's what so can you look at those easements and compare that? Because if the state had to purchase the avigation easement, I would think the town, the planning board would want to make some funds available or request that the council make some funds available if they're going to make it more restrictive than what the state did.
Hey, Ron, shouldn't the state's height requirement coincide? Yeah, shouldn't they all be consistent?
Well, any easement that's negotiated between RIAC and a property owner, that's basically a private agreement. So it's not the same as any statutory requirements.
I wonder if it's
That's
if
correct.
the compensation was a private agreement and the easements are the exact same. Because they put in place the easement and then we had to negotiate the compensation. So the easements may be the same and it's a matter of record on my deed. So, I mean, it had to be submitted and recorded at the town. So I would assume that is all detailed in there.
If it's a recorded document, we can certainly look at it and see what it says. And it may not be the same for every property owner. I just don't know what's in those easements.
So I don't know if you could contact RIAC and then have them review with you and then look at what your restrictions are. And because their restrictions go in a curved pattern, not a flat 15 feet straight across, because they look at a kind of a beveled where the airplane comes in, that's the deepest, and then they branch out in sort of a V fashion.
Yeah, we can do a little research into what the easements say. Sure. Did you have anything else, Bruce?
I think that's it. If you guys could pursue that, I'd appreciate it.
Will do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And we have Dennis back. Go ahead, Dennis, unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you, Ron. Just
Sure.
one quick follow-up. I write better than I speak, and so I am wondering if I could put all of my concerns onto an email and send it out to not only you and Rita, but the planning board.
Absolutely, and that's a good reminder to me. I was going to say this earlier, is that anyone who's listening to the conversation tonight, if you have comments, questions, concerns that you want the board to get, you can email those to me. My email is rwolansky@middletownri.com, and we will certainly distribute any correspondence we get to the planning board. I think I don't want to speak for the board or the chairman, but I think based on the conversation so far tonight, it seems like we'll be doing some more work. There'll be some more investigation and discussion on the ordinance before moving forward. So I think there's plenty of time for folks, say over the next week or so, to get us additional comments.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome. And Rita, maybe since, was there just that one email that you saw that came in? Maybe it would be appropriate, Paul, if that's okay, to have Rita read that if,
Sure.
if she, if she doesn't mind.
Go ahead, Rita.
Second.
Just so the board will have a flavor of all the comments that we've received up until now.
Rita, can you read that email that you received?
Sure. So this was an email received today from Sean Collins regarding airport zoning overlay mandate directed to Mr. Chairman Croce and members of the planning board. It says, I'm submitting this letter in support of adoption of the airport overlay zone as required by Rhode Island General Law Section 1-3-5. My name is Sean Collins. I am the Eastern Rhode Island manager for the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, the AOPA. AOPA is the world's largest aviation membership organization representing general aviation interests of 320,000 aircraft owners and pilots across the country, including 600 in the state of Rhode Island. As the planning board is aware, airspace and approach zone obstructions, including unmitigated vegetation, tree growth, jeopardize the safety of operations into the Newport State Airport. As a temporary corrective measure, the Rhode Island Airport Corporation is obligated to displace the runway 4 threshold, reducing its usable length by about 900 feet. While the operation of light aircraft is tentatively safely retained through this action, business-oriented aircraft operations are restricted. Each day these threats are not resolved, the vegetation and the risk to safe aircraft operations continue to grow. The mandate to adopt overlay zoning has existed for decades. While adoption of the overlay does not itself resolve concerns with existing obstructions, a more timely implementation could have prevented many of the threats facing the Newport State Airport today. Instead, a clear and obvious threat to safety continues to loom, placing potential liability on the doorsteps of Town Hall. The AOPA is committed to ensuring the safety and future viability of general aviation airports. We ask the town of Middletown to join us in that commitment to safety, and please adopt the airport zoning overlay as expeditiously as possible. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Michael?
So he's implying here that there's some liability for the town if we don't get this issue addressed and settled. Can Chris say anything about that?
We talked about this earlier. Chris is going to look into what the ramifications are for the town if we don't adopt the zoning.
Right.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
Paul,
as much as I would love to have a ready answer for the board right now, it's something that I'd like to answer with facts.
But,
Go ahead, Bill.
well, thank you. But really, I mean, yeah, I suppose we could not act on this and not approve it, not send it forward to the council. But we're charged with doing that. We're charged with providing a safe ordinance for the town council to ultimately make the decision. So as much as whether we support this or not, I think is immaterial. The fact is we need to put together an ordinance or a proposal that is safe, that complies with certain standards, and then give it to the council and say, hey, we may not like this, or we may like this, but this is the best we can do. And then it's really in their hands to adopt the ordinance. That's what our council does. They adopt ordinances. We don't have a say on whether we adopt it or not. We can recommend it or not. I mean, I'm inclined to feel like, hey, look at what I'm hearing is that there is a requirement of us to be in compliance, and right now we're not. So we need to do our diligence, get it done, get it to the council, and let them do their thing. I'm more inclined to want to look at the work that we've done already, and I think it's real good work, and I support it. From what I've heard tonight, I've heard two things that I would put on the table as my items that need to be looked at. And one would be, as we identify existing conditions, I think we need to be more clear on what, and if we're talking trees, because I think that's really the hazard that is the hot button right now. There could be a couple of others, but I think we need to do better at, within the ordinance, at identifying what the existing trees are, what the existing structures are, rather than to speculate 10 years from now, well, that was existing. Well, how do you know that was existing 10 years ago? I think we can do better with language there. I think that's important. Secondly, I think if we are heading this way, do we need to call it the airport hazard area? Can we find a softer word and take the word hazard out of it? I mean, I know a duck is a duck if it's quacking, but sometimes just in first glance of looking at it, I have a concern with the word quote hazard. I think we can soften that up as well. But I think we need to move forward and do our best at getting some type of an ordinance to the council for them to look at and continue to receive input from the public. But those are my two items that I came out tonight with, hearing the public already. And I think we need to move on it and move forward. Not just yet, we're not quite ready yet, but I think sooner rather than later, we need to move this to the council.
Thanks, Bill. Ron, are there other members of the public?
Not at the moment.
Okay. Could I ask either you or Joe to give again the purpose of this overlay?
Yeah, Ron, I think you can probably summarize it best, given the compliance element kind of thrust upon the town of Middletown by the state.
Yeah, it really is the statutory requirement to adopt this type of regulation, and the purpose of the regulation is to protect the public from the potential hazards. I know Bill doesn't like that word, but the hazards of living next to the airport, and then also to maintain the viability of the airport as an operation. So there's, looking at it two ways: maintaining the viability of the airport and also protecting the safety of the surrounding property owners.
And is it another question, Ron? Is it a requirement that existing structures and vegetation be grandfathered?
Under typical zoning law and adoption of zoning regulations, pre-existing non-conforming uses typically are allowed to continue. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes you'll see what's called a sunset provision within the zoning ordinance, that within a certain amount of time, any non-compliance must be brought into compliance. That doesn't happen all that often, but it's something that is done on occasion. So for example, in sign regulations, I think that's the one that comes to mind as happening more frequently than other areas, is sign regulations that are adopted sometimes do have these sunset provisions, that any signs that aren't in compliance within a certain number of years are forced to be taken down or brought into compliance. That's just one example. But typically any zoning ordinance amendment will not apply to a pre-existing non-conforming use. Those uses and conditions would be allowed to continue.
Thank you. Well, go ahead, BJ.
No, I just have something that sort of is a comparison, and it may not be a logical comparison, but how many people have noticed National Grid out chopping away at trees without letting people know that they're going to be cutting their trees because they're a hazard? I don't know if there's any relationship that you can make at all with this, but it just dawned on me, because how often do we go out and we see these huge trucks there and they're chopping away at trees?
Yeah, BJ, that comes from a utility easement that grants them the right to do that.
Oh, okay.
I would hazard sorry for the word choice, Bill. Many many of our properties will have one of those utility easements. If you actually read your deed, they're all over the place. I don't think that's where we are now, but I understand the analogy, but there's different
Okay.
mechanism for
Thank
that.
you. Yeah, I didn't know if it was analogous, so thank you.
Thanks, BJ. Go ahead, Joe.
Oh, I have one quick question for Chris. So I tried to be a good listener and take notes tonight. And I think to a person I heard mention economic hardship and diminished property value. And Chris, I would ask, especially from a landscaping, tree trimming standpoint, is there, to bring certain things, items, trees, landscaping into compliance, is there any financial incentive and or reimbursement that the state might be able to offer? That's a question. I'd love to see what the answer to that might be.
Well, could I suggest?
And I
something that-
agree.
Could I suggest something at this point? It seems to me that this needs some additional work. And certainly, I wrote down a number of issues that should be addressed, I think. And they include the question of liabilities to the town, the question of the easements that the airport corporation has put in place, the question of compensation that was just raised. And while when Ron read the statement of purpose, he talked about protect the public from hazards. I think the use of the word hazards in that context is fine. I am sensitive to Bill's concern of the use of hazard in describing the area. But I think the purpose has to be clear, and that the ordinance is supposed to protect the public from hazards and also protect the viability of the airport. And I think it should be re-examined with that in mind. And I also think the subcommittee should address the question of sunset provisions, whether they are appropriate or not. We need to, all these questions came up tonight and we couldn't answer them. So I think there's more work that needs done. And by the way, in naming this a hazard area, is that with the town of Middletown, or does that come from the state?
I don't know if there's any requirement that that word be used.
Well, then let's not use it then, and maybe call it something else that is less onerous to the nearby homeowners.
I have a suggestion.
Go ahead, BJ.
One of the things that was brought up in my little greeting or whatever yesterday with some of the airport people was the economic impact that the airport has on Aquidneck Island, and that many people don't realize. This is what I was told. The large amount of funds that come into Aquidneck Island via this airport. So I thought maybe I should just bring that out.
Well, I know it's the second most widely used airport in the state. I don't know
Yes.
how significant that is, but I'm not sure I want to get into the economic impact of the airport, but we should address these other questions because they do relate to the purpose of this overlay.
Mhm.
Mike, another comment?
One of the things I think that's given us a lot of trouble is we don't know what the state is eventually going to say, which leaves a lot of the things that we're trying to do kind of nebulous, and hard to define. I think once the state kind of says, what the requirements are going to be, and if this bill ever goes through, and I know it's in the General Assembly now. If it goes through and what it says, is it going to be helpful to us in trying to figure the answer to all these questions or not? I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
By the way, another question that I think should be looked into, I don't know if it can be answered, but the question of what happens if we do nothing. I think we have to send something to the council that they can wrap their hands about. If we give them something that has too many loopholes or openings, they'll just reject the whole thing. They've done that in the past when we've sent stuff to them. So it doesn't help them at all, I feel, unless we can give something that is pretty set and defensible.
Paul, I hear you on that. Can I just, I hear you on that. I think that the work that you guys have done, the subcommittee, is close. I think it's very close. So I don't think we're that far apart, that far away from it, but I think you're right. We need to get something there because we're not in compliance, and if we're held not in compliance, there's liability there as well. So
Yeah, I agree. I'm not criticizing the subcommittee. I think we are.
Not at all.
There are just some additional questions that came up this evening that need to be answered.
Yep.
Is everyone pretty much in agreement with that course of action? Sending it back to the subcommittee. Joe, you okay with that?
And my recommendation would be, I think Chris has been charged with obtaining some new information based on the public input and questions that were raised tonight. I think we should, Ron and Rita, determine what he gets back. And then I am more than willing to reconvene the subcommittee with, additional input that, I think the full planning board now has participated in discussion and critique in a good way of the work that's been done thus far. And it's by no means complete. So I say we take a couple more bites at the apple based on input we get from Chris and try to make a better document that can ultimately go to the town council.
Everyone okay with that? Bill?
Just one more comment, Paul. As I sit here, I think, the hazard thing to me keeps coming back. I've been thinking, I have a suggestion. The airport protection area. I mean, I think we're protecting a lot of things within that. So that's a starting point. But so, if I can put that out there, we can start with something. But I think renaming is important to me. Identifying existing conditions is important to me. And much of the other stuff falls in line with that Paul brought up as well.
Okay, so is everyone okay with that?
Sure.
Joe, you're okay? And Mike and BJ, you're all set as members of that subcommittee?
Yes.
Yes, just
All
let
right.
us know when.
Do we need to make a motion to that effect, or can we just turn it back to the subcommittee?
I think you're fine. I think by consensus, it's pretty clear that the board wants the subcommittee to take another look at this, and I can, after tonight, like we said, we'll give Chris a little time to do some research, and we can do, planning department can do some research maybe on the easements, and once we're ready, we'll get a meeting scheduled of the subcommittee.
That would be great.
Thank you.
Is there anything else to bring up on this matter, the airport overlay? Is there anything else to be brought up at this time by anything? On anything, rather, excuse me. Okay, may I have a motion to adjourn the meeting then?
So moved.
Second.
A motion made and seconded to adjourn the meeting. Mr. Pyrick,
Aye.
Mr. Chumo is recused. Mrs. Owen,
Yes.
Mr. Weber is recused. Mr. Fenton,
Aye.
Mr. Nash,
Aye.
and I vote aye. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
all.
folks.
Thank you. Nice
Good work,
work,
guys.
everybody.
Thank you.